Inside the cozy coffee shop, the owner ejects an elderly black woman, unaware that Michael Jordan is watching every move. Little does he know that at that very moment, a whirlwind of secrets and unexpected twists is about to change everything. The first crack appeared at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dr. James Whitaker stared at the hairline fracture running down the hospital wall, barely visible against the sterile white paint. Most would have missed it entirely, but James had spent the last 15 years of his life in this building. He noticed everything. His fingers trembled as he reached out, tracing the fissure with his fingertip. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you are watching us from. We continue. Dr. Whitaker, a nurse's voice echoed down the corridor. She's coding. The crack forgotten, James sprinted down the hallway, his white coat billowing behind him. The hospital's emergency alarm blared overhead as he burst through the double doors of the ICU. Around him, doctors and nurses moved with practiced urgency, a ballet of organized chaos. In the center of it all lay Maddie Parker, 72, still wearing the simple blouse she'd collapsed in just hours earlier. 3 days ago, Maddie had been managing her health conditions with quiet dignity. Now, her small frame looked impossibly fragile, against the hospital bed as her body convulsed violently. "She's seizing again," Dr. Patel announced, adjusting the IV drip. "Temps 104.2 and climbing." James pressed his stethoscope to Maddie's chest. The rapid, irregular flutter of her heart told him everything he needed to know. He'd heard that sound 5 times before. 5 patients, 5 deaths. "Get me 30 milligrams of methylprednisolone," he ordered, his voice steady despite the knowledge weighing on his chest. He locked eyes with Maddie's grandson, Michael, who stood frozen in the doorway, terror etched across his face. James knew what he had to do, but doing it meant betting his entire career. The experimental treatment protocol he'd been developing wasn't approved. Using it now would violate every regulation in the book. But the alternative was watching. Another patient die from the mysterious inflammatory response that had already claimed 5 lives in their small town. The floor beneath them trembled slightly. Another crack, wider this time, splintered across the ceiling. "Dr. Whitaker, we're losing her." James made his decision. He pulled the unmarked vial from his lab coat pocket, the culmination of his private research, the treatment he believed could work. The treatment that violated hospital protocol and quite possibly his medical oath. "Everyone out except essential personnel," he commanded. The room cleared, except for him and Dr. Patel. "James, what are you doing?" Patel whispered, watching as he prepared the injection. "Saving her life." He pushed the needle into Maddie's IV line, "and ending my career." As the clear liquid disappeared into the tubing, James felt the weight of his choice settle in his stomach like lead. Behind him, the crack in the wall continued, its silent journey across the hospital ceiling, a physical manifestation of the fracture that had just formed in his perfectly constructed life. The floor shuddered again, more violently this time. 6 months earlier, James had been the golden child of Maple Ridge Memorial Hospital, chief of infectious disease at 39, respected researcher, and recently divorced. His life was exactly as he'd designed it. Clinical, efficient, controlled. "Another late night, Dr. Whitaker?" Security guard Johnny Depp smiled as he swiped his key card at the lab entrance. "Just following up on some cultures." He returned Johnny's smile without breaking stride. The truth was more complicated. For weeks, James had been tracking an unusual pattern of symptoms in patients throughout the county. 3 cases in the last month alone, all presenting with rapid onset systemic inflammation, high fever, and neurological symptoms. All previously healthy, all dead within 72 hours. The CDC had been notified, but their response was bureaucratic and slow. Insufficient evidence of an outbreak pattern, they'd said. James disagreed. That night in his lab, he examined tissue, samples from the most recent victim, searching for answers in the microscopic realm where he felt most comfortable. He preferred the predictability of cellular biology to the messy complications of human interaction, a preference that had cost him a marriage but earned him professional acclaim. His ex-wife, Eleanor, had called him pathologically detached during their last fight. The words had stung precisely because they contained a kernel of truth. James was most comfortable with facts, data, solutions. Emotions were variables he couldn't control. "Dr. Whitaker," the voice startled him from his thoughts. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Michael Chen, the newly appointed hospital administrator. At 35, he was younger than James, with a reputation for budget cutting and efficiency, two words that made research scientists cringe. "Working late again?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were assessing. "Just following up on those unusual cases I mentioned in the staff meeting." He straightened, protective of his unauthorized research. "The ones the CDC doesn't consider priority?" His eyebrow arched. "The board is concerned about resource allocation, Dr. Whitaker. Your department's overtime has exceeded budget for 3 months running." James felt a flicker of irritation. "3 people are dead, Dr. Chen, from apparently unrelated causes, according to official findings." His voice softened slightly. "Look, I understand your dedication, but you need to follow protocol. If there's something worth investigating, do it through proper channels." After he left, James sat alone in the sterile brightness of his lab. He'd built his career on following rules, on being methodical and thorough. But something about these cases haunted him, not just the medical mystery, but the faces of the families left behind, the mother who'd clutched his arm and asked why no one could save her daughter, the husband who'd sat motionless in the waiting room for hours after his wife was pronounced dead. For the first time in his career, James found himself contemplating what it would mean to break the rules he'd built his life around. 2 days later, the 4th case arrived. Lily Carmichael, 42, office worker, no prior health issues. By the time she reached the hospital, the inflammatory response was already shutting down her organs. As her condition deteriorated, James made a decision. He began developing his own treatment protocol in secret, pulling late nights in the lab, bypassing required approvals. He'd present it for proper review once he had concrete results, he told himself. It wasn't ideal, but people were dying while the system moved at its glacial pace. What he didn't know then was that the ground beneath Maple Ridge had been shifting for decades. The abandoned mine that ran beneath the town's east side, beneath the hospital itself, had been slowly collapsing, destabilized by years of groundwater seepage. The first small tremors had been easy to dismiss, attributed to heavy construction equipment or passing trains. But beneath the surface, something more dangerous was brewing, both in the crumbling mine tunnels and in the bodies of Maple Ridge's residents. James's eyes flew open at 3:28 a.m. to the sound of his phone ringing. His apartment was dark, the sheets tangled around his legs from another restless night. "Dr. Whitaker." His voice was instantly alert, despite the hour. "It's Chen. We've got another one." Same presentation as the others. James was dressed and in his car within minutes. 5th case in 2 months, far beyond statistical probability for their small town. As he drove through the pre-dawn darkness, his mind raced through possibilities. Environmental toxin, unidentified pathogen, contaminated water source. The patient was Marcus Turner, 15 honor student, found unresponsive by his parents that morning. By the time James arrived, Marcus was in full systemic inflammatory response, his body at war with itself. James moved through the examination with clinical precision until he reached for Marcus's hand to check capillary refill and found the boy's fingers curled around a small stone carving of an elephant. "He won't let go of it," the nurse explained. "It's his good luck charm." Something in James cracked then, a small fissure in his professional detachment. He thought of his own childhood talisman, a silver coin his father had given him, now tucked away in a drawer untouched for years. "We'll work around it," he said quietly. For the next 36 hours, James fought for Marcus's life with everything in his arsenal. When conventional treatments failed, he considered using his experimental protocol, but stopped himself. It wasn't ready. The risks were too great. Marcus Turner died at sunset on a Thursday, still clutching his elephant. That night, James sat alone in his office, staring at the vial of clear liquid he'd developed, his unauthorized treatment, now refined but still untested. On his desk sat the medical files of all 5 victims, and beside them, a map of Maple Ridge with their homes marked in red. A pattern was emerging. All 5 lived on the east side of town, above the old mining tunnels. The door opened, and James quickly covered the map. Dr. Chen stood in the doorway, his usual confident posture replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "You were right," he said simply. "The CDC is sending a team tomorrow." James nodded, too exhausted for satisfaction. Chen stepped further into the office, closing the door behind him. "I've been reviewing the case files. The geographic clustering is concerning. I believe it's environmental," James said cautiously, "possibly related to the old mining operation. If that's true, half the town could be at risk." He ran a hand through his hair, a surprisingly human gesture for someone James had categorized as a bureaucratic machine. "What do you need from me?" The question caught him off guard. "Access, resources, time." "Done." He held James's gaze. "But I need complete transparency from you. No solo missions, Dr. Whitaker. Whatever you discover, whatever you develop, we do this by the book." James nodded, acutely aware of the unauthorized vial hidden in his desk drawer and the months of unsanctioned research behind it. "We'll save the next one," Chen said as he turned to leave. Neither of them knew that the next one would be Maddie Parker, or that the ground beneath their feet was becoming more unstable with each passing day. Later that night, alone in his lab, James faced his reflection in the darkened window. He barely recognized the man staring back. There were new lines around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there 6 months ago. His phone buzzed, with a text from Eleanor. "Heard about your cases on the news. You okay?" He didn't reply. Their relationship had ended because he'd chosen his work over their marriage, over the family she'd wanted to build. Now, ironically, it was these patients, these strangers, who were finally breaking through the walls he'd constructed so carefully around his heart. The hospital building creaked around him, a subtle shifting that most would attribute to normal settling. But James, always attentive to details, paused at the sound. Something was changing in Maple Ridge, something fundamental. And he was running out of time to discover what it was. The experimental treatment flowed through Maddie Parker's veins as James held his breath. Around them, monitors beeped in urgent cadence, and somewhere in the distance, a rumbling sound grew louder. Dr. Patel glanced nervously at the widening crack in the ceiling. "James, I think we should evacuate. The building's not stable." "We can't move her now," he insisted, his eyes fixed on Maddie's vital signs. "If we interrupt the treatment—" The ground beneath them lurched violently. Equipment crashed to the floor. Outside in the hallway, people shouted in panic. "Hospital evacuation protocol initiated," announced the overhead speaker. "This is not a drill." Michael appeared in the doorway, terror in his eyes. "What's happening?" "Sir, you need to evacuate, Dr. Patel urged, moving toward him. James remained at Maddie's bedside, adjusting the drip rate of his experimental treatment. The floor shifted again, and a ceiling tile crashed down beside him. "Dr. Whitaker!" Chen's voice cut through the chaos as he entered the room. "The mine beneath us is collapsing. We're evacuating the entire hospital." He paused, taking in the scene. "What is that you're administering?" Before James could answer, Maddie's monitors began to stabilize. Her oxygen levels rose, her heart rate steadied. Not coincidental timing. This was the response he'd theorized, the immune modulation he'd designed his treatment to achieve. "It's working," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Chen's eyes widened as he connected the dots. "Your unauthorized research." It wasn't a question. Another violent tremor shook the building. Chunks of ceiling plaster rained down around them. "We need to move now," Chen ordered. "Get her on a transport ventilator." Together, they transferred Maddie to a portable unit. As they raced down the hallway toward the emergency exit, James explained his theory in clipped sentences. "The old mine, the collapse is releasing heavy metal contaminants into the groundwater. East Side residents have been exposed for months. It's triggering an autoimmune response in genetically susceptible individuals." Chen processed this as they pushed through the exit doors into the chaos outside. Emergency vehicles surrounded the hospital. In the distance, a massive cloud of dust rose from where the east wing had partially collapsed. And your treatment? Targeted immunosuppression with accelerated chelation. A team of paramedics took over Maddie's care, loading her into an ambulance. Michael climbed in beside her, casting one grateful look back at James. Chen pulled James aside as the ambulance doors closed. Around them, the evacuation continued. Hundreds of staff and patients streaming into the parking lot under the guidance of emergency personnel. "You violated every protocol we have," he said, his voice low and intense. "You could lose your license for this." James met his gaze unflinchingly. "I know. If it works, if she survives, it could save countless lives." "I know that too." The ground trembled beneath them again, a reminder that the danger wasn't over. Chen's hand closed around his arm, steadying him as he swayed. "The board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m., he said. "I expect a full disclosure of your research, your methods, and your results, however preliminary." James nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis began to ebb, leaving him hollow. "And James?" Something in his tone made him look up. "I'll speak on your behalf." Before he could respond, a deafening crack split the air. They turned to see the hospital's east wing collapse entirely, disappearing into a massive sinkhole that opened beneath it. The crowd of evacuees cried out in shock. In that moment, watching his workplace of 15 years crumble into the earth, James felt oddly liberated. The rules and structures that had defined his life were literally falling away. The next morning, he stood before the hastily assembled hospital board in a conference room at the Maple Ridge Hotel. His hands were steady as he presented his findings: the environmental contamination, the genetic susceptibility pattern, and the treatment protocol he'd developed without authorization. "Dr. Whitaker's actions were reckless and in violation of hospital policy," said Board Chairman Davis, his expression stern. "Dr. Whitaker's actions saved Maddie Parker's life," Chen countered, "and potentially identified the cause of an environmental health crisis affecting our entire community." The debate raged for hours. James sat silently, watching the interplay of politics and ethics, strangely detached from his own fate. In the corner of the room, a small television silently displayed news footage of the hospital collapse. The ticker at the bottom announced, "Massive sinkhole reveals toxic contamination in abandoned mine." By evening, the board reached its decision. James would be suspended for 3 months, but his research would receive emergency funding for continued development. Outside the hotel, he stood in the fading light, uncertain what to do next. His apartment was in the evacuation zone, his workplace destroyed, his career in limbo. "You look like you could use this," said a voice beside him. Chen held out a cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool evening air. "Thank you." The words encompassed more than the coffee. "Maddie Parker is stable," he told him. "The treatment appears to be working." Relief washed through him, not just for Maddie, but for all the potential patients his protocol might save. "What happens now?" he asked. Chen gestured toward the horizon, where the dust from the collapse still hung in the air. "We rebuild, differently this time." He paused. "Both the hospital and the community." James nodded, understanding the magnitude of what lay ahead. The environmental cleanup alone would take years. The medical research to fully validate his treatment, months at minimum. "I had you wrong," Chen said quietly. "I thought you were just another researcher more interested in publications than patients," James almost smiled. "And I thought you were just another administrator more interested in budgets than medicine." For the first time in years, James felt the weight of his self-imposed isolation. The walls he'd built around himself, professionally and personally, had been as rigid and ultimately as fragile as the structures that had collapsed into the earth. As he stood there, his phone buzzed with a text. Eleanor again. "Saw the news. Tell me you're safe." This time he replied, "I'm safe. Everything's changed." 3 months later, Maple Ridge was still recovering. The sinkhole had been stabilized, but nearly a third of the town remained in the evacuation zone. The hospital operated from a temporary facility on the west side, where James, now reinstated, led the environmental health response team. It was there that Maddie Parker found him, her small frame moving slowly but purposefully. Toward his makeshift office, Dr. Whitaker. Her voice was stronger than he remembered it. James looked up from his microscope, momentarily disoriented. After treating hundreds of patients exposed to the mine contaminants, seeing one fully recovered was startling. "Mrs. Parker, come in." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, taking in her healthy appearance with clinical satisfaction. She sat cautiously, her hands folded in her lap. "Michael wanted to come thank you himself, but he's helping with the community center today." She set a small envelope on his desk. "He wrote you this." James picked up the envelope, unexpectedly touched. "The thing is," Maddie continued, "I don't actually remember much from when I was sick, but everyone keeps telling me you broke all the rules to save me." She met his eyes directly. "Why'd you do it?" The question caught him off guard. Why had he risked everything for this woman, for all of his patients? The answer had seemed simpler, before the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. Maddie nodded, seeming to accept this. "Well, Michael is considering medical school now, because of you." She stood to leave, then hesitated. "Dr. Chen said you might need volunteers for your community testing program." The mention of Chen brought an involuntary smile to James's face. Their relationship had evolved over the past months, from reluctant allies to something more complex. Not friendship, not yet, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "We could always use help," he told Maddie. "Send him by tomorrow." After she left, James opened the envelope. Inside was a simple card with 2 words, "Thank to you." Beneath it, Michael had written, "For remembering she was someone's grandmother before she was your patient." The words stirred something in James, a recognition of how much he'd changed. Before the crisis, he'd treated patients with clinical excellence but emotional distance. Now he knew their names, their stories, their fears. He was interrupted by a knock at his door. Chen stood there, his usual pressed shirt replaced by a casual sweater. "The town hall meeting starts in 20 minutes, he reminded him. They were presenting their findings on the environmental impact to the community today, part of their commitment to transparency in the recovery process. "I'll be right there." He gathered his notes, aware of Chen watching him. "I spoke with the National Institutes of Health this morning," he said. "They're fast-tracking approval for your treatment protocol based on our emergency data." James nodded, absorbing the news with complicated emotions. Professional vindication, yes, but also awareness of the cost at which it had come. "You never asked why I supported you," Chen said suddenly. "With the board, with the NIH application." James paused, realizing he was right. "Why did you?" "Because 15 years ago I lost my mother to an autoimmune disorder that no one could diagnose in time." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held old pain. "I recognized your determination." The revelation shifted something between them, another crack in the professional facade they both maintained. Outside, the temporary community gathering space was already filling with Maple Ridge residents. James recognized many faces, patients he'd treated, families he'd counseled. The crisis had forced him to engage with his community in ways he'd avoided for years. As he stepped onto the small stage with Chen, James noticed Eleanor in the back of the room. She raised a hand in greeting and he nodded back, surprised by the absence of old pain. Their marriage had ended because they'd wanted different things, but perhaps they'd both changed in the intervening years. The town mayor introduced them, and Chen began their presentation with the clinical facts, the extent of contamination, the cleanup timeline, the medical monitoring program. When it was James's turn to speak about the health implications, he set aside his prepared remarks. 6 months ago, I knew Maple Ridge as data points, mortality rates, disease clusters, demographic statistics, he began. I treated patients, but I didn't see people. He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. The ground shifting beneath us changed more than our physical landscape. It changed how we relate to each other. From the back of the room, Eleanor nodded slightly, acknowledgement in her eyes. The recovery ahead is long, James continued, but we're standing on firmer ground now, not just geologically, but as a community. We're watching for the cracks, and we're supporting each other when they appear. Later, as James walked back to his temporary apartment, he felt the weight of exhaustion, but also something lighter, something like hope. The physical rebuilding of Maple Ridge would take years, but the human connections forged in crisis would endure. His phone buzzed with a text from Chen. Dinner tomorrow to discuss the NIH protocols, of course. James smiled at the transparent excuse. Of course, he replied, 7 p.m. The ground beneath his feet was solid as he walked, no tremors or shifting, just the steady earth supporting each step into an uncertain but promising future. 2 years after the first crack appeared in the wall of Maple Ridge Memorial Hospital, James stood in the atrium of the newly constructed medical center. Sunlight streamed through the vaulted glass ceiling, illuminating the memorial wall that bore the names of those lost in the crisis, including the 5 patients whose deaths had launched his investigation. "It's quite something," said a familiar voice beside him. James turned to find Johnny Depp, who had left his security position to become the hospital's community liaison, studying the architectural details of the space. Time and shared experience had forged an unexpected friendship between them. "The whole building's designed to flex during seismic activity," he told Johnny. "We learn from our mistakes. Some of us faster than others." Johnny's smile was gentle, without accusation. They walked together, through the atrium, an ease between them that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. Johnny now coordinated with community members affected by the environmental disaster, bridging the gap between medical staff and patients. "Your Dr. Chen seems impressive," Johnny noted, as they spotted Chen directing a tour of visiting officials through the new research wing, the wing that housed the James Whitaker Center for Environmental Medicine. "He's not my Dr. Chen," James protested automatically, though the slight flush in his cheeks betrayed him. Johnny laughed. "You've changed, James. It suits you." Before he could respond, Michael Parker approached them, now in his 2nd year of pre-med and working as an intern at the center. "Dr. Whitaker, they're ready for you in the auditorium," he announced with the enthusiasm of youth. James nodded, suddenly nervous about the dedication ceremony ahead. Public speaking had never been his strength, and being the center of attention went against every introverted fiber of his being. Johnny squeezed his arm in encouragement. "I'll be in the audience. Go change the world." As Michael led him toward the auditorium, James reflected on the chain of events that had brought them here. One crisis, hundreds of lives affected, a community rebuilt from its literal foundations, and himself, transformed from a detached researcher to someone intimately connected to the pulse of his community. Dr. Michael Chen met him at the auditorium entrance, his usual composure slightly disrupted by the day's significance. "Ready?" he asked, offering a reassuring nod with a formality that made James smile, "As I'll ever be." Together they walked onto the stage, facing the gathered community of Maple Ridge, patients, colleagues, officials, friends. James saw Maddie Parker, in the 3rd row, beside Marcus Turner's parents, who had established a scholarship fund in their son's memory. Eleanor sat near the back, next to Chen's family who had flown in for the occasion. As the mayor introduced him, James thought of the small fissure that had first appeared in the hospital wall, how he'd traced it with his finger, not understanding. It was the first visible sign of the ground shifting beneath them all. "Dr. James Whitaker," the mayor announced to applause, "whose courage and vision saved countless lives and transformed our understanding of environmental medicine." James stepped to the podium, his notes prepared but suddenly inadequate. He looked out at the faces before him, each one connected to him by the invisible threads of shared experience, of crisis weathered together, of healing both medical and communal. "2 years ago, I stood in a hospital room and made a choice," he began. "I chose to break the rules I'd built my career upon, because sometimes the old foundations can't support what we need to become." In the audience, Chen nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving his face. The cracks that appeared in our town, in our hospital, in our ground, in our lives, revealed what had been broken all along, James continued. Systems that didn't serve us, divisions that weakened us, isolation that impoverished us. He thought of his own isolation, the walls he'd built around his heart in the name of professional detachment, and how thoroughly they had crumbled. Today, we dedicate not just a building but a commitment, to see the cracks when they first appear, to listen when the ground speaks to us, and to rebuild together when necessary. As he concluded his remarks to standing applause, James felt a familiar hand on his shoulder. Chen beside him now, as he had been through the rebuilding of their community, their hospital, and his own capacity to connect. The new medical center stood solid beneath their feet, built with the knowledge of what had gone wrong before. But more importantly, the community within its walls stood stronger, watchful for the first signs of fracture, ready to support each other when the ground inevitably shifted again. James looked out at the gathered faces one more time, colleagues who had become friends, patients who had become partners in healing, strangers who had become neighbors. The weight of silence that had once filled his carefully controlled life had been replaced by something noisier, messier, and infinitely more valuable. The sound of connection, the sound of life, cracked open and made whole again.